Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. Usually, when somebody is standing in front of you, you want to know three things. So who is standing in front of you? Why is this person standing in front of you? And then what is he about to say? So I was already introduced, so the first one, who am I, is being settled. Why am I standing here is I've got an MBA and a PhD in economics, and I specialized in China. So that is something that that I will focus on in my presentation. Is Manoeuvre Warfare dead? The aim of the conference is to take a holistic view on the subject. And I will look at the geo-economic level and then taking the example of China to make my point. As the war in Ukraine is ongoing, China as a threat seems far away. But it is actually happening right now, at least in economics. My thesis is the indirect approach will be that if we are not capable to defend against an opponent using the very much same indirect instead of the direct approach. I prefer those terms when it comes to the geo-economic level instead of maneuver and attritional warfare. Or listening to our last Belgian speaker from this morning, maybe I should rephrase it and call it a system destruction warfare. I will come back to that at the end. The outline, and those are my guiding questions to structure the presentation. I mean, first of all, we have to find out if economics is part of the grand strategy of China. And if that is the case, we have also looked into the aspect if the strategic culture of China is a more defensive or a more offensive culture. So we have to look at that as well. And then when we then talk about how to use economics as a weapon, would that be in a direct or an indirect way China is using that? And then we also have to look into, because we are talking about systems, that we are talking about an authoritarian regime facing liberal democracies. So what are the characteristics, and does it matter when it comes to the direct or indirect approach in applying instruments from economic warfare? And then, of course, how will that look like? And in the end, to ask, okay, if that is happening, how can we, as a liberal democracy, with a market economy, how can we defend against something like that? So, grand strategy. I will not read that out. You can read that, but the main point I want to make here is that when we look at Chinese grand strategy and then Western grand strategy, they are distinct in two, I would say mainly in two ways. One is that the instrument being used by China in an understanding of a grand strategy is much more numerous than it is in our. When we look at, for example, the national strategy of Germany, and we look at the instruments being named and described, it's much, they are much less compared to what China understands of what instruments they can use to get to their aims. The second aspect is it is not constrained, the grand strategy of China is not constrained to external security. So the internal security, and that means the survival of the Chinese Communist Party and the system as such, that is one of the core interests of the Chinese grand strategy, which is usually not the case when we talk about a westernized grand strategy. Of course, it is an aim that we protect our democracy, but it's not in that sense. And that leads to the point that the national economic development, if that is endangered in China, also external actions across all domains are deemed justified and necessary. We all know, probably, or at least here in that institution, we all know the famous Art of War from Sun Tzu. So in China, it has the same importance as Clausewitz has in westernized strategic thinking. So, but not only that, if we take other original sources from China, for example, the three warfares, that is a concept that encompasses public opinion, psychological, and legal warfare. So these are the three warfares. So when we take all those sources and we take Sun Tzu and the Art of War, and that as the foundation for strategic thinking, you know, the same, and what I've outlined here, it leads to two conclusions. One is the indirect approach is being favored and used. And the second is that China sees itself as purely defensive. It is a self-perception, and that is how it is communicated. When we look at realpolitik, then you could also say that the Chinese have never fought a war they didn't like. You can take what is being considered the area of humiliation. So when we look at what happened, first with the colonial powers, but then with Japan. So that is something that they forced out in a way. But anything else, there was never a war that China was involved that they didn't like. A preemptive strike is part of this understanding. If national core interests are being threatened, then it is justified. We would call that offensive. In the Chinese understanding, it is not. So when we look at the white paper, that is called active defense, that is the military strategy, there are no offensive. The Chinese will never have an offensive. They only use defensive offensives. It's a nicely phrased term, but it's interesting, and I think it mirrors their understanding. Some intermediate conclusions before, we go finishing with the grand strategy, finishing with the strategic culture, and then move on to coming back to the indirect approach. And I said, because we are outside the pure military application, I'm talking about geoeconomics. So I tried to pinpoint, when we're looking at that level, what are the aspects of the indirect approach that are important for our analysis here. And when we look at those characteristics, We have to take into account the differences between the authoritarian regimes and liberal democracies. First is that there's a much faster decision-making in those regimes. It's a centralized power, there's no debate, public consultation, legislative approval. There is, especially when it comes to us here in Europe, there's no alignment with EU politics or any other supranational politics, especially in the field of economy. As you know, that's one of the pillars where the EU has a very high level of competence. The second is the rapid implementation. So there's no opposition. There are no legal challenges. It's a very strong top-down approach. It's much more consistent across regions and administration. I mean, the Germans and the Austrians, they know when we talk about the federal level and the state level and the challenges coming from that. And it's a more, there are more synchronized actions possible. And the third one is that there's a better information dissemination. There's a direct control over media, including social media, and usually you don't have public protest. So to steer the public opinion is much easier in authoritarian regimes than it is in liberal democracies. So when we now look, and this is my own table, so what I try to do is look at what are the usual instruments of economic policy, and then I clustered them or I put them into, what is a more direct approach and what is a more indirect approach. And let me take examples. I cannot be, because of time, I don't want to be exhaustive on this. I'm not going through everyone, but just to take maybe two examples. One is what China is doing is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road. When you look at the effects and what is taking place, here we are talking about strategic investment, what is happening. And by that, there is political capture in those countries where it is invested. But you will also find when we talk about, or when you read about Belt and Road Initiative, that the term debt trap diplomacy is being found. But when you strictly look into that, and a thorough analysis shows that this is not really the case, but it will not minor the effect of political capture. Of course, when you have such an investment and it's not conditioned, that those countries are more favorable looking at the investor, in this case China, it is not necessary that the terms of the loan has to be extremely narrow and China-oriented, or the investor-oriented. It could be just a normal contract, but still the effect on the political side is still there. So they don't have to, it's still there. So when you look at Belt and Road Initiative, and when you see where the sea-based trade is flowing, you see the sea lanes of communication, it mirrors perfectly how the main trade routes are taking place. You can also look at Hungary. For example, when you look at the voting behavior of Hungary using its veto where it's possible in the European Union, well, you can call it bias or not, but empirically you can look at the voting behavior that is so much in favor of China, and that is China is one of the biggest lender of money. The problems Hungary has in the EU. So China stepped in. And the case of Italy, who was the first partner in the European partner in the Belt and Road Initiative. So they are more like on, off, but still you see the effect there. Second example, I take is the rare earth. That is, it's not so much about the share of mining and the stock, so what is on raw material in the ground. It's not so much about that, because there you have alternatives, but it's the refinery capacity that China has, and it is about the control over the production value chain. It's about skills and research and development capacities. 2 examples. We have 2 high, at the moment, priority political aims at EU level. One is the Green Deal, so the transformation into low carbon economy. And of course, now with the war ongoing, it's security. When we look at the refinery capacity, graphite, which is extremely important in that regard, especially when it comes to, for example, batteries or so, 90% of the world refinery capacity for graphite is in China, or is Chinese controlled. For security, we all know for artillery, we need gun cotton, Schießbaumwolle, gun cotton. It's 70 to 80%, everything is happening in China. When we look at the value chain, 80% on solar panel production level is happening, or is Chinese controlled, is in China. 60% of wind turbines in China. 60% of electronic vehicles, batteries, China. And I say China compared to the rest of the world, 60%. So those are 2 examples. So, as you can see, rapidly, we are coming to the end. So, of course, this is when, I put everything here that if it is distributed, it's easier. If you only have keywords, sometimes it's difficult, but with that, it's more. So when we see the activities that is happening in Africa, Belt and Road Initiative, I said, in Europe, Italy, Hungary, Serbia was visited by President Xi as well. When we look at the initiatives in the Global South, like BRICS, well, the activities with regimes like Iran, Russia, and North Korea, the backing of the fight against Israel, that is also taking place. The backing of anti-democratic parties, we have a big issue with that in China, in Germany, and the AfD. And when we look in other areas like the fait accompli in South China Sea, where the reefs and shoals are being reinforced, the maritime militia used by China, but also when we look at the Chinese-Indian border, the construction of dual-use villages. So in case of, it can be used militarily because the infrastructure is already there. So the application of that strategy is already taking place. It's not something in the future, it is taking place right now and here. We have to be aware that our decision-making in politics and economy is separated and very distinct from each other, but not in China. So here, like when companies do investment decisions or decisions in economy as such, they are in China, they are not based on prospects of turnover, market entry possibilities, market share, profit as such, but they are ultimately following a political goal, designed and outlined in a grand strategy. And that is also important, finally, our understanding of a time horizon regarding China is off as well. We have heard this morning about the maneuver's approach when we talk about military doctrine and what is the time there. But also when we talk about strategic management, we have, I know it's extremely difficult, but we have to get rid of our time horizon that we apply to everything when we look at China, because they have a much wider, much longer perspective on that. So, last one, and then I'm finished. I would like to come back to the beginning. Is maneuver warfare dead? As we all know, it was designed and interpreted as the antithesis to the direct attritional approach. I think the indirect approach has to face one difficult challenge. How do we counter an opponent not using mainly attritional elements? But indirect means in a time frame alien to us and our systems as well. As I said, antithesis, say, okay, how do we counter attrition? Maneuver. But what when somebody's using maneuver, how do you counter maneuver? With attrition or with maneuver itself? And are we capable of doing that? Having our liberal democracies and our cornerstones of our system in mind. How will that look like? And as you know, as I said, that is my last slide. I will not go into that. That I will talk about at the next conference, probably. Yeah, so that is my thesis, and looking at the geo-economic level. And I hope we start doing that right now. As I said, it is ongoing. It is not something that is, lurking around the corner. They wait until the war is over and then they start. It is happening right now. Thank you very much.